She saw Henri for the first time in a cafe by the lake, the air filled with the smell of freshly ground coffee. When he looked up and their eyes met, it was as if time had stopped for a moment. Curious, Isabelle approached, drawn by the mystery of the young man, her blue eyes curious and vibrant as she gazes at the surroundings. A moment that would change everything. The sun reflected on the crystal-clear waters of Lake Geneva, creating an almost magical glow that made the small Swiss village seem like it was straight out of a dream. Isabelle, her long blonde hair loose in the wind, felt the gentle breeze caress her face as she walked along the path by the lake. She had come to spend the summer at her aunt's house, expecting nothing but tranquility and idyllic landscapes. However, fate had other plans. She saw Henri for the first time in a cafe by the lake, the air filled with the smell of freshly ground coffee and the scent of flowers decorating the place. He was alone, hunched over a sketchbook, lost in his drawings. His tousled brown hair and focused expression revealed a young artist, perhaps a few years older than her, engrossed in his own world. When he looked up and their eyes met, it was as if time had stopped for a moment. Curious, Isabelle approached, drawn by the mystery of the young man. "You're a good artist," she said softly in French. Henri smiled, raising an eyebrow, surprised by the interruption but immediately charmed by her presence. "Just doodles. But thanks," he replied shyly as he closed the sketchbook, as if it were something too personal to show. From that moment on, their days became inseparable. Together, they walked through the hills surrounding the lake, laughed at little things, and talked about their dreams. Isabelle wanted to travel the world, see new cultures, and live life intensely. Henri, on the other hand, was more reserved, a dreamer who preferred the silence of his drawings and the landscapes that only he could see so deeply. But there was one thing they shared effortlessly: love. It wasn't something planned, but rather a feeling that grew like a quiet flame, warming their hearts in a way that neither could deny. They met every day at the same cafe, under the watchful gaze of the mountains that surrounded the lake, and there they talked about everything and nothing. One afternoon, as the sun was setting and the sky turned a deep pink, Henri took Isabelle's hand. "I didn't know love could feel like this," he murmured, unable to take his eyes off hers. For a moment, she felt the world spin around them, as if there was nothing but that moment. "Neither did I," she replied, her voice low, almost a whisper. Time passed too quickly, and with each sunset, the feeling between them grew more intense, more inevitable. The village, with its bucolic landscapes, became the perfect backdrop for the love blossoming between them. Every glance, every touch, seemed destined to last forever. But life, like an unstoppable current, was already beginning to suggest changes. With each passing day, summer neared its end, and with it came the certainty that their romance would have to face its first challenges. Neither of them mentioned the future, preferring to live in the present, savoring every moment together as if they were eternal. However, there was an inescapable feeling, a subtle shadow that hung over their daily meetings, something that both knew but had yet to face with courage. And then on that magical afternoon by the lake, Henri did something unexpected. He stopped walking, turned to Isabelle, and said in a serious voice, "Isabelle, what will happen to us when summer ends?" The silence that followed seemed to carry the weight of a decision that would change everything. Summer was drawing to a close, and the fresh air that had once promised carefree days now felt heavier, as if heralding the arrival of difficult times. Henri's question lingered unspoken, floating between them like a cloud filled with uncertainty. Isabelle felt the growing weight of that question, knowing that the end of the season brought more than just the simple farewell to the lake and the village. Their future was on the brink of rupture, and she couldn't shake the feeling that time was against them. Henri, always reserved, seemed to be battling his own thoughts. He knew that Isabelle belonged to something bigger than that village, bigger than Switzerland. Her dreams were leading her far away, to places he could only imagine. He, on the other hand, felt rooted there, in the hills, on the peaceful shores of the lake, in his drawings that captured the silence around him. He couldn't imagine life outside that setting. And as much as his love for Isabelle grew each day, he feared that their worlds were irreconcilable. In the last week of summer, the distance between them began to grow, even when they were side by side. Isabelle spoke of her plans to go to Paris, to explore the world, to study, to see things that had never been seen before. Henri, in turn, listened in silence, the weight of their differences growing inside him. He knew he couldn't follow Isabelle, and the more she talked about her aspirations, the more he felt that his place wasn't by her side. Henri carried within him a silent certainty. He was part of that place, of the routines and responsibilities he could not abandon. Isabelle noticed the change. The days that had once been filled with endless conversations about the future now became tense. She saw in Henri's eyes a sort of resigned sadness, as if he already knew that their love, no matter how strong, was doomed to be left behind. For her, it was unbearable to accept, but at the same time, she knew that he wouldn't be able to break away from the life he had built there. When the last day came, the inevitable presented itself. Under a light, melancholy rain falling over Lake Geneva, the two walked together for the last time. Deep down, both knew this would be goodbye, though neither wanted to admit it out loud. The train station, with its somber air, symbolized everything they couldn't control. The end of summer was the end of something much greater. Isabelle, carrying her suitcase, looked at Henri one last time. She knew those weeks wouldn't be forgotten, but there was no going back. The train that would take her home represented more than leaving a place. It was the separation of two worlds that, despite the love, couldn't coexist. Henri remained standing, watching her board, his face marked by deep sadness. For him, the love they shared was real, but he knew deep down that their lives were heading in different directions, and he couldn't go with her. As the train moved, Isabelle looked out the window, watching Henri's figure grow smaller until he disappeared completely in the mist. No promises were exchanged, only the painful certainty that fate had pushed them in opposite directions. She knew she would never forget what they had experienced, and even after many years, that farewell would be etched in her memory. Henri stayed on the platform until the train vanished on the horizon. The emptiness that followed was overwhelming. Even without words, they both knew this goodbye wasn't temporary. It was a definitive farewell, forced by circumstances neither of them could change. The train that took Isabelle away from Henri also led her into a new chapter of her life. Arriving in the Austrian Alps, a region of serene beauty and towering mountains, she began to shape her own story, far from the memories of that summer by Lake Geneva. The scenery that now surrounded her, though breathtaking, brought a certain quietness that reflected in her own spirit. Isabelle got married, built a solid life, but something inside her remained unfinished, a part of her heart always returning to those youthful days. Years passed, and with them came responsibilities, jobs, commitments. Isabelle settled in a charming village, surrounded by the grandeur of the Alps, where mornings began with the sound of birds and the smell of fresh earth after the rain. Her marriage, however, did not bring the same intensity of emotion she had experienced with Henri. Her husband, though attentive, couldn't fill the deep void Isabelle carried in silence. She lived a peaceful, yet incomplete life, hiding within her the scars of a love that seemed more alive in memories than any present experience. Henri, on the other hand, remained in Vienna, a city he had always considered home. After his separation from Isabelle, he continued with his life as best as he could, immersed in his art, drawing the landscapes he saw with his eyes and those that existed only in his mind. His works reflected an almost imperceptible melancholy, a sense of loss he never voiced but was always present, in the lines of every sketch and in the shadows of every painting. He too married, trying to build a new life alongside a woman who offered him stability and understanding. However, like Isabelle, his marriage was not marked by the burning passion he had once experienced. The silent conversations between him and his wife became a tired routine, a reflection of the emotional distance that separated them. Henri never spoke of Isabelle, but in his loneliest nights, her image, walking along the shores of Lake Geneva, her hair illuminated by the sunlight, returned to his mind with painful clarity. Decades passed. Both lived their separate lives, building their respective stories, accumulating experiences and sufferings that shaped them in irreversible ways. And despite having moved on, the invisible bond that once united them was never completely broken. They carried the marks of a love that, though interrupted, never fully faded. Slowly, time began to take its toll. Isabelle, now a woman in her 60s, looked back and wondered what could have been if circumstances had been different. She had her cozy home in the Alps, surrounded by a landscape many would envy, but inside, there was an echo, a longing. At times, she found herself flipping through old photographs, searching in the eyes of her past for something her present no longer offered. Henri, now alone in Vienna after the end of his marriage, also lived on memories. Each stroke of his drawing seemed to carry a piece of the past he had fought so hard to forget. But the truth was he never forgot. Isabelle still inhabited his imagination, as if time had failed to erase the intensity of those days. And so, while the seasons changed, their hearts remained tied to a distant summer, in a village by Lake Geneva. 50 years had passed since that summer in Switzerland, but time, surprisingly, had not entirely erased the memories that Isabelle and Henri held of each other. The scars were there, covered by layers of lived life and choices made. But deep down, the echo of that love still persisted, waiting patiently to be heard again. Isabelle, now in her early 70s, lived a quiet routine in her home in the Austrian Alps. She had grown accustomed to solitude after the end of her marriage and filled her days with small activities, walks through the mountains, quiet afternoons reading by the fireplace. Despite the serenity that surrounded her, there were moments when she felt invaded by an inexplicable restlessness, as if something were still about to happen. It was during one of these afternoons, while casually browsing the internet, that something unexpected happened. Isabelle, without any expectation, was scrolling through social media when a familiar name caught her attention: Henri's brother. Her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a name she had heard or seen in decades, but the mere mention brought back memories she thought were long buried. Hesitant, she clicked on the profile. The photos revealed fragments of a distant life, but it was one picture in particular that froze Isabelle in her place. A recent photograph of Henri, his hair now completely gray, but with the same calm gaze she would recognize anywhere. He was older, of course, but still carried that reflective, introspective air that had captivated her so much in their youth. For a few minutes she sat there staring at the screen, not knowing what to do. That accidental discovery seemed like fate, something impossible to ignore. Overcome by a mixture of nerves and nostalgia, Isabelle decided to act. With trembling fingers, she sent a polite message to Henri's brother, asking how he was and mentioning that she had been a longtime friend. She didn't expect an immediate response, but to her surprise, just a few days later the reply came. Henri was doing well, though life had been full of ups and downs just like Isabelle's. His brother, friendly and helpful, did not hesitate to provide Henri's contact information, suggesting that it might be a good idea for them to reconnect after so many years. Isabelle hesitated. For days she wondered whether she should really reach out to Henri again, whether she should stir up a past that, though still alive in her mind, belonged to another era of their lives. But the impulse was stronger. A week later, she gathered the courage and sent a message to Henri. His response didn't take long, and the emotion they both felt upon reconnecting was almost immediate. The first exchanges were timid, filled with formalities, but soon the conversations began to flow more naturally. Each message seemed to awaken dormant memories, as if 50 years of distance were gradually dissolving between the words. Phone calls followed. Each call was a journey to the past, but also a rediscovery of the present. Henri talked about his life in Vienna, about the paths fate had led him down, and Isabelle, in turn, spoke about her years in the Alps, her marriage, and the marks life had left on her. But behind all that, there was an underlying current that connected them once more. Something that neither of them mentioned directly, but that was there, in the subtext of every conversation. Over time, it became clear that their reunion was not just a coincidence but a second chance. Feelings they both thought had been dormant began to awaken, as if 50 years hadn't passed. Isabelle, once skeptical about the power of fate, began to realize that some stories never truly end. They merely go on hold, waiting for the right moment to begin again. The conversations between Isabelle and Henri became more frequent and intense. At first, the two treated their interactions with a light formality, addressing only the most practical aspects of their lives. However, with each phone call, the layers of emotional distance they had built over the years began to dissolve. Isabelle, hearing Henri's soft and familiar voice, felt a wave of nostalgia that transported her back to her youth. Henri, in turn, was surprised to realize that Isabelle still had the power to awaken feelings in him that he thought were long forgotten. It was during one of these quiet nights, while they spoke on the phone, that Isabelle allowed herself to admit something that had been growing inside her. Though decades had passed and their lives had taken different paths, the connection between them had never truly broken. The memories of the moments they had shared by Lake Geneva returned to her mind as if they had happened yesterday, not half a century ago. Henri couldn't ignore what he felt either. The conversations with Isabelle brought him a sense of joy he hadn't experienced in years. She awakened in him the same quiet and deep passion he had felt in his youth. As the weeks went by, the two set aside their initial reservations, allowing themselves to speak openly about what they had lived and the impact that separation had had on their lives. On one particularly cold night in the Alps, Isabelle found herself looking out the window, the moon reflecting on the snow-covered mountains, while she listened to Henri's voice on the other end of the line. He spoke about his drawings, about how he continued to capture the landscapes of Vienna, but his words seemed loaded with deeper meaning. There was something they both knew but still hesitated to say. The love they had once shared hadn't disappeared. On the contrary, it had survived time, like a flame that never went out but waited for the right moment to rekindle. The days turned into weeks, and the phone conversations began to include laughter and confidences. The details of their lives, failed relationships, frustrations with the passing of time, became just the background for the rediscovery of a much older and truer feeling. Isabelle, who had spent so many years hiding her emotions behind a facade of tranquility, now felt her heart race with each phone call. And Henri, always so restrained, realized that Isabelle still occupied a central place in his life, a place that no one else had ever been able to fill. One evening, as the conversation flowed, Isabelle took a deep breath and made a decision that would change everything. "Why don't we meet in person?" The question had been in the air for some time, but neither of them had dared to say it until that moment. The silence on the other end of the line lasted only a few seconds, but for Isabelle, it felt like an eternity. Then Henri agreed, his voice filled with restrained emotion. It was as if fate, which had separated them so many years ago, was finally giving them the chance to correct the past. The decision was made. Isabelle would travel to Vienna. The thought of meeting Henri again filled her heart with anticipation and fear, a confusing mixture of emotions she hadn't felt since her youth. And for Henri, the idea of seeing Isabelle again after so much time was both wonderful and frightening. They both knew that this meeting wouldn't just be a reunion between two people, but the reconciliation of a love that had survived time, choices, and distance. Isabelle began planning the trip carefully, but what really kept her awake at night was the anticipation of what it would be like to look into Henri's eyes again and realize that time, indeed, hadn't erased what they felt. The train taking Isabelle to Vienna wound through fields and mountains, while she nervously watched the landscape pass by outside the window. In her heart, there was an intense mix of anxiety and hope. The trip, which was supposed to be a simple reunion between old friends, now carried the weight of 50 years of unfinished feelings. Isabelle wondered what Henri would be like in person after all this time, and more importantly, what it would be like to reunite with a love that, against all odds, remained alive inside her. When she finally arrived at Vienna's train station, Isabelle took a deep breath. The day was clear, the autumn air fresh and inviting. She stepped off the train, adjusting her coat, while scanning the crowd for the familiar figure of Henri. He wasn't immediately visible, and for a moment, her heart raced with a mix of disappointment and nervousness. But then, in the midst of the crowd, she saw him. Henri stood by a bench, waiting. He looked different, of course, time had left its marks, but there was still something deeply recognizable about him. The way he kept his hands in the pockets of his coat, his calm and attentive gaze, the slight slouch of his shoulders, as if he carried a long story with him. When Henri's eyes met Isabelle's, time seemed to suspend itself. She approached, her heart pounding. No words were spoken in the first few seconds. They just looked at each other, both surprised by the strength of the emotion that the moment brought. Isabelle remembered what it was like to be by his side. But now, after so much time, there was a depth in the silence between them that carried the weight of all the years they had spent apart. Henri was the first to speak, his voice low and moved. The simplicity of the words he exchanged with Isabelle, talking about the trip, the weather, and small formalities, contrasted with the avalanche of emotions they both felt inside. Yet, they both knew that there was no need to verbalize what was really happening. The reunion itself said more than any words could express. As they walked together through the streets of Vienna, the city serving as the backdrop for this long-awaited moment, memories of the past began to emerge. The conversation, initially hesitant, became more relaxed, and soon they were laughing and recalling episodes from their youth. Both were surprised at how much time seemed not to have changed the essence of what they shared. When they sat down at a cafe on the edge of a quiet square, the conversation finally delved into deeper waters. Isabelle, feeling safe in Henri's presence, confessed that despite all the twists and turns her life had taken, she had never stopped thinking about him. Henri, in turn, admitted that in all those years, no one else had taken the place she had left in his heart. The intensity of that moment was almost overwhelming, and they both allowed themselves to feel the truth. The love they had shared hadn't been destroyed by time. They were no longer the young people by the shores of Lake Geneva, but somehow that feeling still existed, as strong and palpable as before. As the day began to fade and the city lights came on, Henri invited Isabelle for one last walk along the banks of the Danube. The water reflected the city lights, and the silence between them was no longer uncomfortable but full, filled by the simple presence of one another. Henri and Isabelle knew that something significant had been restored that day. It wasn't just the reconnection of two people, but the reunion of two souls that, for decades, had patiently waited for this moment. The reunion in Vienna, filled with emotions and overwhelming nostalgia, made Isabelle and Henri realize that the love they had shared had never truly faded. Sitting by the Danube in a silence that spoke louder than any words, they realized that fate had once again placed them on the same path, and now it was up to them to decide what to do with this second chance. In the days that followed, Henri and Isabelle spent more time together, exploring the streets of the Austrian capital, talking about the past and speculating about the future. Their conversations flowed naturally, as if they had never been apart. It was clear to both of them that the intensity of the feelings that had been dormant for so long had returned with force. However, now with the wisdom that age had brought, they knew they needed to be careful in their decisions. As they walked through the gardens of Schönbrunn Palace, enveloped by the beauty and grandeur of the place, Henri asked a question that had been on his mind since their first reunion. "What do you think about being together for real, Isabelle? We can have what we lost. We can start over." His words, though calm, carried an intensity that touched Isabelle deeply. She remained silent for a moment, watching the sun set behind the hills. The idea of starting over after so many years seemed frightening and at the same time irresistibly attractive. In her mind, she returned to the village by Lake Geneva, where it had all begun. Youth, hope, dreams, it all seemed so distant. But at that moment, there was a new possibility in front of her. A chance to live what had been interrupted so long ago. Isabelle finally responded. She agreed with Henri. She felt that their love deserved a new chance, and that life, despite all its twists and turns, had brought them to this moment for a reason. What remained now was to plan how they would shape this future together. Henri, always thoughtful, suggested that marriage would be the most natural way to seal their union. Both had lived through decades of uncertainties and missed opportunities, and now in their 70s, there was no time to waste. The idea of an intimate ceremony, surrounded only by those closest to them, appealed to them. There was no need for grand celebrations. The simple fact that they were together was enough. With the mutual agreement that they would marry, they began discussing the details. Henri mentioned that Salzburg, with its romantic landscape and mountains in the background, would be the perfect setting. The austere beauty of the castles and the charm of the city would bring a special meaning to the moment, as if the wedding was not just a celebration but a kind of closure to a cycle that had begun so many years ago. Isabelle, moved, agreed with the choice. The mere thought of standing beside Henri in such a magical place seemed surreal, yet incredibly right. It was as if, after so long, fate was finally giving them the ending they deserved. With the plan set, the next few months would be filled with preparation and anticipation. The ceremony would be simple but full of meaning, a celebration of a love that had withstood time and adversity. And so Henri and Isabelle, ready to write the next chapter of their lives together, finally left the past behind and embraced the future that awaited them. The day of the wedding arrived with a bright blue sky, punctuated only by light clouds drifting over the mountains surrounding Salzburg. The small ceremony had been carefully planned to be simple, intimate, and deeply meaningful. The guests were few, only the closest family and friends, those who had accompanied Isabelle and Henri's journeys over the years. The chosen location was an old castle on the outskirts of the city, its stones worn by time but still standing tall, much like the love that would be celebrated there. Isabelle, in an elegant, simple silk dress, stood in front of a mirror, her eyes shining with an emotion that mixed nervousness and happiness. The years of separation, the choices that had led them down different paths, now seemed distant. It all came down to this moment. As she gently adjusted the veil over her shoulders, a soft smile lit up her face. She was ready to finally live what had remained unfinished for so long. Henri, for his part, waited anxiously in the castle hall. He, always a man of few words, now felt the weight of an emotion that overwhelmed him completely. His love for Isabelle, which had never waned, now reached its pinnacle on this day. He wore a dark suit, discreet but elegant, and though he tried to hide his nerves, his fingers fidgeted with the ring he would soon place on her finger. When Isabelle appeared, walking down the castle aisle toward him, time seemed to stop. Each step she took was a reminder of how long they had waited for this moment. Henri, his eyes fixed on hers, could hardly believe that after everything, they would finally be together. The small chapel was filled with a magical atmosphere, where the past, present, and future intertwined in a single instant. The words exchanged during the ceremony were simple but filled with depth. There was no need for grand speeches. What they felt was understood by everyone present. Isabelle's gaze, locked on Henri's, reflected the certainty that the love they had shared for decades was real and strong enough to challenge any barrier. When the vows were exchanged and Henri placed the ring on Isabelle's finger, a wave of emotion swept over them both. It wasn't just a symbol of marriage, but the confirmation that fate, though cruel in the past, had finally brought them together. The kiss that sealed the ceremony was the culmination of years of longing and repressed love, now released and celebrated. After the ceremony, The guests gathered for a simple reception in the castle gardens, surrounded by the natural beauty of the mountains. The soft light of late afternoon bathed the scene, creating an atmosphere of tranquility and joy. Conversations flowed, laughter filled the air, but above all, there was a sense of fulfillment. Isabelle and Henri, holding hands, never strayed far from each other. The look of complicity between them spoke more than words ever could. That day, they didn't just celebrate a legal union, but the triumph of a love that had never died. The past, with all its pain, now became part of the story that had brought them there, and the future, which once seemed uncertain, now shone with the promise of days shared, finally side by side. After the wedding, Isabelle and Henri decided to settle in the Austrian Alps, where the tranquility of the mountains provided the ideal setting for the new beginning they had long desired. The small house where Isabelle had lived now became their home. Surrounded by the grandeur of nature, with snow-capped peaks in the background and a silence broken only by birdsong, it was the perfect place for a love that had finally found peace. The days passed simply but with deep satisfaction. Henri dedicated himself to his drawings, capturing the alpine landscapes with a precision and sensitivity that only the passage of time could bring. Isabelle, in turn, found comfort in her daily routine, in the walks they took together at sunset, and in the moments of companionship they shared by the fireplace on colder nights. Life, which had once seemed so full of uncertainties, was now marked by a tranquility that both embraced with open arms. Despite everything, it wasn't the absence of challenges that made them so happy. What truly kept them connected was the certainty that, after so much time, they had overcome the most difficult obstacles: time, distance, and the choices of the past. The feeling of having finally found the right person at the right time filled their hearts with an indescribable calm. There was a deep understanding between them, as if words were unnecessary. The neighbors in the village soon noticed Henri's presence, and gradually, he too became part of the small local community. Over time, the people around them began to learn their story, the interrupted romance of their youth, the decades of separation, and the miraculous reunion in their old age. Their love story seemed to inspire everyone who knew them. Isabelle and Henri became a symbol of the power of destiny and the resilience of true love. One cold afternoon, as they drank tea on the terrace of their house, with the view of the mountains ahead, Isabelle looked at Henri and smiled. It was a smile full of gratitude, as if she was still surprised by the fact that, after so many twists and turns, they were there together. He smiled back, gently touching her hand. They both knew that even in the quietest parts of their lives, there was a depth in being by the side of the right person. Time passed softly, and their story, which once seemed so full of unresolved tragedies, now blossomed into a new phase. The two, aware of the brevity of life, cherished each moment as a gift. The challenges that had tested their patience and love in the past now seemed insignificant. The journey they had traveled together, even with all the detours and missed opportunities, had led them exactly where they were meant to be. In the serenity of the Alps, Isabelle and Henri discovered that true love not only survives time but is strengthened by it. Maturity had brought them the understanding that love didn't need to be perfect or immediate, just sincere and constant. They no longer sought grand gestures or the fiery passions of youth, but the calm and joy of daily companionship, of love lived in its purest and most enduring form. Finally, after so many decades, they had found the happiness that had always eluded them. And as the sun set behind the mountains, lighting up the sky with shades of orange and pink, Isabelle and Henri felt that, at last, they were home, where they had always belonged, side by side. Isabelle and Henri's story reminds us that true love, no matter how much it faces time and distance, always finds a way to be reborn. Even after so many decades of separation, they proved that fate can surprise us, bringing a second chance when we least expect it. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel to discover more heartwarming stories like this. Don't forget to share it with someone you love. and hit the notification bell to keep up with our next tales of love, reunions, and overcoming challenges. Let's explore the power of emotions together.